This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Meredith Gadsby, who teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at Oberlin College. Along with essays on migration, literature, and identity, she is the author of Sucking Salt, Caribbean Women Writers, Migration and Survival from 2006, and co-editor of Decolonizing the Academy, African Diaspora Studies from 2003. In this conversation, we discuss the politics of Black study inside and outside the academy, the complexity of thinking diaspora, and the place of literary work in Black studies. Good morning, Meredith. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm doing great.
I am so happy we had this chance to talk on the podcast for a number of reasons. We met each other many years ago when you were at Amherst College visiting to do external review, and I really love your work. I think it's really important that we have literary-minded people on the podcast. I think it's actually not a gap, but where we need more people. So I'm really interested that way to get your research and your reflections on Africana studies and literary studies on this. And also, why not put it out there? Congratulations, Miles and Caleb. Our sons graduated from Morehouse College this past May. So congratulations to both of them.
And congratulations to you. This is quite the milestone for parents as well.
Yeah, I was going to say congratulations also to all the tuition payers who may or may not be on this phone call.
Yeah, exactly. And my husband is Morehouse class of 92, and so it was a special moment. And we actually met there when I was on exchange, when I was an exchange student from Vassar College. We met in class on Spelman's campus, so it was just a weird and wonderful moment of just a full circle.
That really is. I love how all those things fit together in the, father-child legacy, but also the, parents meeting, all that. What a great occasion. It's great to have that tuition bill off the books as well. But time for these boys to start paying their own bills.
Mm-hmm.
Not that we've been talking about that before I hit record or anything. But anyway. Long way of saying, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. Really looking forward to chatting.
I'm so excited about this. You have wonderful colleagues who've also participated, so I'm in good company.
Yeah, you're going to be episode like 302, 303. I mean, we've really racked up some numbers here. So there's always, amazing. And so many more people to come. So our list is just massive while also having gone through a lot. Yeah, I've been so pleased with how many people have volunteered their time and real intense thoughtfulness. Has been I've learned so much on the series. So, and I look forward to learning today from talking with you. And we'll have a chance to talk about your research and how you think about Black studies and the relationship between these. But I wanted to start really with like a more personal question and ask you, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And what keeps you connected to this kind of research? What keeps you, sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
What drew me initially was really Caribbean literature, to be honest. As an undergraduate, I took a course in Caribbean literature, and it was the first time that I saw the language or the English that we spoke at home on a page, and it wasn't caricature. It was an accurate depiction. It was Brown Girl, Brownstones by Paul Marshall. And the immediate connection for me was it was obviously a different historical period, but she was writing about being a Caribbean American girl born to Barbadian parents in New York City, and she grew up in Brooklyn. And I also was a Caribbean American girl born to Barbadian parents, and I grew up in Queens for a bit of time, Brooklyn, but mostly in Queens. And so there was much that was recognizable, even though she was so many years older than me. And that book made me want to read more books like that. Right? It made me understand that the lives and experiences of everyday average working people were remarkable, right? And their backstories and their histories were remarkable. And it also made me feel, I already knew that I was part of a vast Caribbean American community. I grew up in a Black community that was Caribbean and African American, and to some degree African, but a great amount of diversity in Blackness. That moment helped me see myself as part of a larger community of people who had been moving around the world in different ways. And so that prompted me then, when I was on exchange as an exchange student, to kind of pursue that a bit more. I came across a book while I was at Vassar before I went on exchange by Carol Boyce Davies called Out of the Kumbla, and it was about Caribbean women's writing. It was the first feminist perspective on Caribbean women's writing. And I bought the book and I put it on my shelf and I didn't look at it again. And then I went on exchange. I took classes with people like Gloria Wade Gales and Mona Phillips and other folks, and started to become interested in teaching and learning more about that work. So my kind of diasporic experience gave me a foundation from which to launch. And so then I launched into the academy in that way. I asked Dr. Gales for advice on graduate programs and such, and she sent me to Dean Cynthia Spence, who was the dean for exchange students, who then connected me to Siga Jung, who was a grad student, who was a Spelman alum and a grad student who had finished her work at SUNY Binghamton, and her mentor was Carol Boyce Davies. And I reached out to Carol Boyce Davies and asked her if she'd be willing to work with me, and she was. And so from then on, I just kind of catapulted into this intellectual community of diasporic thinkers who were Africanists and Caribbeanists and African Americanists. It was so it was a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary Black feminist universe of scholarship that all began in that small space of reading Brown Girl, Brown Stones as, I guess, maybe a second year in college.
I love that. I mean, it's amazing what classrooms, but even more specifically, even microscopically in terms of lifespan, how like a book can have this massive shift in the idea of what a person's life will be. I mean, it's a reminder to me, because this comes up, more than, in almost every one of these opening narratives on the podcast of just how transformative classrooms can be. And as educators, I try to keep that foremost in my mind because, as you know, it's so easy to just really get burned out on teaching. And like, there's all these other things going on at universities in times of crisis, budget problems, salaries, whatever, class sizes. But the possibility that a book or a class or a sequence of classes have this kind of transformative effect, I love that. And I love that you're able to really give that the name both to the book and to a place. I mean, so, and it's also a reminder the way that Black studies and sort of study of Black life broadly has so many different kinds of origins, because it was the book, it was a class, but it was also this expansive life experience, that spread out from your own home. But did you feel like then that college was this college course or college broadly was that moment where that life in Queens, right, found a way of having an echo, a mirror, a place, whatever, however you want to characterize it, in study and scholarship? Or did you have a sense even like K through 12, right? Or was there such a disconnect between your community life, home life, and school life, K through 12, where sort of college was that moment that just changed everything?
I would say college really introduced me to a different way of thinking about my experience. Like, my experience was my experience. I didn't connect it to kind of any broader movements of Black people or Black history. And I had family in Europe. I had family in London. I had obviously still family in Barbados, had family, mostly in the New York tri-state area. But I didn't know that their movements were part of a larger history of movement,
Mm-hmm.
Across the Atlantic. I didn't know that then. I knew that many of my friends had similar experiences, right? Many of us were raised in families where there were plenty of nurses and educators, right? Civil servants. Many of us would go to Barbados or go to the Caribbean in summers, and spend time with folks. They would come to the U.S. I knew that part. But I didn't make that connection. And it was in college, in the classroom, that I started to think about how this was part of a larger history that was really complex and connected to even broader histories of colonialism and enslavement. As a K through 12 student, I wasn't thinking about any of that.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the first inkling I might have gotten was in AP American History, in which the instructor, who interestingly was a PhD, told us that slavery really wasn't that bad for African Americans and for Africans across the Atlantic world, because masters didn't really want to damage their enslaved people, so they gave most of the dangerous and most difficult work to indentured laborers. And I remember sitting in the classroom going, I saw Roots, and that's not what I saw in Roots.
That's
What?
wild. Yeah.
And I remember just questioning it, and other students were kind of looking at him, but we didn't quite yet have the knowledge
Sure.
or even the vocabulary to challenge him. And then it was in college when I started to learn, right, in a wonderful network of courses about kind of Black Atlantic history, that I understood, not just the disservice that he had done the entire class, not just me or people who look like me, but the depth of the work and the research that already existed that helped people connect the dots, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't I don't know that I would have been able to do that or see it in the same way if I didn't have really conscientious instructors who were committed to doing that work, kind of illuminate that book for me, or those books in general, not just
Mm-hmm.
Brown Girl, Brown Stones, but that history.
Yeah, and I'm also it's so nice to hear the way you found your fit for a doctoral program,
Mm-hmm.
because I know, having mentored undergraduates who are looking at graduate study and talked to graduate students about their decision to come to University of Maryland's English or comparative literature departments.
Mm-hmm.
The fit is so huge, but it's so hard often for people to understand how huge fit is. They can get fixated on, there's this one person, Carol Boyce Davies, I'll go study with her, or whoever. But to find this broader fit, when you were saying that, I was like, I hope this doesn't take a turn of
No,
I only had one person, and instead you're like,
Mm-mm.
no, it's like a whole intellectual space, and
Yep.
those are good stories. We need those.
And that's what she told me. I think it was wonderful because that's the thing as well, because people kind of follow the name and they get there and that person is either too busy or not interested in working with them. And now many graduate programs discourage students from reaching out to faculty, right? Which is so interesting, because that was kind of the way you did it. You reached out to find out where people were they interested in working with you, and so on. One of the things that Carol Boyce Davies shared with me was that there was a network of professors at Binghamton with whom I could work. And so we'd take a course and they'd send us go study with, Tiffany Patterson, go study with Kelvin Santiago Valles. And so we would move around, and they were in community with each other as well.
Mm.
And so I think that commitment, that question, you had about, how we in Black studies, we manage kind of, social justice, these are not the words you use, but activism and so on, political work with intellectual and academic excellence. For me, they're intertwined, because in my graduate experience, and I recognize that I was spoiled. I only learned that once I graduated from grad school. I stopped talking about how wonderful my experience was because so many people were triggered. That when the work is done really well, there's no separation between the two. I mean, within reason, right? Because people can write whatever they want to write about, right? You can write in an echo chamber to 6 people if you want to. And there is a long tradition from the origins of the field that marry that commitment to intellectual excellence with a mission. Like at
Mhm.
Oberlin, for instance, Africana Studies is the first mission-centered department in the institution, right?
Mm.
So all the other departments, what was once women's studies, now gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, comparative American studies, we were involved even in the establishment of many of those departments and programs.
Mhm.
And so for me, I have not ever had the experience of Black studies not being the both and instead of the either or.
I love that. I mean, it allows you to, you and anyone who has a similar experience to hit like the professional ground, like rooted and moving, right? Rather than like, how can I get my footing in this place that's been so alienating for so long? So
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting because I almost said, what a nice bit of luck, but of course it wasn't luck. It was crafted and informed and conversational. So,
Mm-hmm.
Carol Boyce Davies, by the way, is on the podcast
Of course she
from
is.
a year or so ago. So everybody should look up that episode. And I just love hearing that level of mentorship.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reminder again that we all should be doing these kinds of things, but also
Mm-hmm.
the way it just puts people on a totally different trajectory.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned you began speaking a bit about the Oberlin Africana Studies program,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to ask this other question and maybe sort of back up broadly, and I'm sure this will be a part of your response, and ask you what that portrait of Black studies is. What's that
Mm-hmm.
portrait that you work with? And I always think about this in terms of the tension at the founding of the field, which was that commitment that we inherit, that was a student demand for there to be a place to study the intellectual tradition on campus.
Mm.
And that traditional disciplines had not done this, so students demanded, there be a Black Studies department where the Black intellectual tradition would have a home. And that element of the founding of the field, right, we inherit very much in terms of a commitment to an intellectual tradition. But of course, late 1960s and early 1970s is that moment of shift in terms of Black liberation struggle, where a lot of those boundaries between a classroom and a community, between a book and political mobilization, between ideas and prescription really get contested. And so we inherit, I think, that aspect of the founding of Black Studies in terms of a commitment to a certain kind of liberatory politics. And there's a tension there, right, between a
Mm-hmm.
commitment to intellectual life and commitment to a certain kind of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I call it a tension rather than a contradiction because tensions can have all kinds of resonances. And so just sort of asking it in that context, what is that portrait of Black Studies for you and how does it orient you?
So, I think first you asked the question about how it shows up at Oberlin. So, right? Am I correct?
Or I imagine that'd be a part of your answer, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, at Oberlin, so Africana Studies is as old as I am, right? So it's established in and around like 1972. And the original intention behind it was to navigate and mitigate the experience of all of these African American students who've been brought into Oberlin at a moment where this was happening right at other schools, right? We had like the Ford Foundation and Mel Foundation founding, um, you know, um, different programs, if you will, right, that were supposed to support bringing Black students in for a variety of reasons, some of them great, some of them messy. And so many of the institutions, of course, are not prepared and have no interest in being prepared or preparing themselves to welcome these students. So obviously, these were not welcoming spaces. However, one of the things that you find, so in our Africana Studies 101 and in our intermediate seminar and our senior seminar for majors, we have the original documents, like the original
right.
proposal that was shared with the college faculty, right? And in it, the authors of that document really shrewd. One of the things they argued was that Oberlin had been woefully underdeveloping its students by not teaching them any aspect of African history or African culture, i.e., how do you teach about Greek and Roman history without talking about Africa, right? How do you talk about Middle Eastern politics, right, writ large, and not talk about North Africa, right? And so the way it was framed was that this is something that needs to happen. Like, this is a curricular change that needs to happen that benefits all students. And if we are to be committed to sending students out into the world prepared to challenge, which is supposedly the part of Oberlin history, right? In terms of this kind of anti-slavery narrative, we are not properly doing that. We're shirking our responsibility. So I come to this department that's framed in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And also, um, there was never a freestanding African Studies department or program here at Oberlin. And so that erases some of the kind of early suspicions that you find in the 70s between Black studies departments and African studies departments, because people are concerned that that really is just a space to train intelligence operatives to destabilize, right, African nations, right? African political systems.
Yeah.
So we don't have that. Also, the department was diasporic from its inception. So we had a scholar, Yakubu Saka, who also was actively engaged in Ghanaian politics, served as a minister of culture in many government positions. So we had an Africanist, we had a Caribbeanist historian. We had Calvin Herndon, who was an African-Americanist, a literary scholar and writer himself. Adrian Lash Jones, who did African-American history and women's history, right? So they're the gender, sexuality, and feminist studies. You see like the kernels of that there. Education, right? And political engagement through a scholar named Booker Peak. And so our department was it was obviously interdisciplinary, as they often are, but it was also very diasporic. So by the time I arrived, there was a very strong foundation for that work. And so I think Black studies, right now we're Africana studies, Black studies, the potential for Black studies to really be a place to study and engage the African and African diasporic world was baked into this department before I came. And so that allowed for a space of a lot of dynamism in that whatever it was that you were teaching from whatever disciplinary perspective you were coming from, you could do that work here. And we had scholars who were scholars in their own right, were actively engaged in writing and actively engaged in intellectual work, who were also activists at the same time and were living that activism through their political engagement, right? So the models for me here, I think I can't say that they're unique and that they didn't exist anyplace else. I wouldn't make that argument at all. But what I would say is for me, in terms of the way that I was trained as a scholar, it was a recognizable space, right? That didn't involve competition or antagonism, even around how we talked about Africa and Africanity, right? It was not essentialist. We also have a long-standing, we anchor the Black Arts program in dance, studio art, and theater, right? And so that also, I think, helped because there wasn't this dichotomy between intellectual work and the arts, right? There was a lot of synchronicity and a community of colleagues that understood the mission of the work too, and didn't feel like that mission meant sacrificing. The other thing I would say is one of the challenges I think that we still have in institutional spaces is, how people want to talk about the difference between like intellectual and academic excellence and ideology. So our department consists of 9 faculty, 4 of whom are joint appointments, and we are all of African ancestry. And so there are some who challenge that and they wonder how it can be so. And so the default speculation is that there's something happening here where, there's something is happening here that's exclusionary, without considering that searches are national and international, and we every time excellent, absolutely excellent candidates who happen to be of African ancestry rise to the top of the pool, right? I don't think it's coincidence. Guess what? There are a lot of us out here. And so I guess going back to your original question, again, that, so you didn't really want to call it attention, But I think there is a tension, and a lot of that has to do with the pre-existing institutional politics into which people walk. Right? Without being able to manage those institutional politics, what happens is they become toxic and they fester, right? And then those types of conversations are distractions where instead of thinking about the points of connection and how to bring how there is to talk about the synchronicity, right? Like we can do that. We end up not talking about that and talking about as something else. Because I think the field now is so vast, it's like there's room for everyone, right? There's room for that 1970s model in a particular kind of way, right? If there's a balance, right? And if there is a department in which you have multiple voices that can be equally heard, that can challenge each other in the best ways. And I find that the institutional politics get in the way. I think the other issue as well, and No Leeway Rooks writes about this, is the institutionalization of Black studies, right?
Yeah.
You know, the tenure process, the promotion process demands a certain type of rigor, right? That is generally not defined by the colleagues themselves, it's defined by the institutions. And so once we get into these spaces where we now need to be promoted, right, to be able to continue to do the work, it shifts the frame a bit. So we can still talk about political engagement and the work that we want to do, but there are particular standards for intellectual excellence that we're now forced in the 80s and the 90s and so on, right? The whole idea of publish or perish becomes even more precarious for so many of us, especially if we're committed to doing that kind of community engaged work, however you describe community, whilst also trying to live up to those standards. So I think it's important to think about the institutional limitations, like not just Black studies itself, but the institutional limitations placed on Black studies scholars as we are and have been trying to do this work, right? In certain types of ways. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that was fantastic. Thank you. There's a lot to think about in there for everybody listening. You raise so many important questions and have so many, like, for me, really compelling observations about what it means to construct a department, right? And you didn't quite say it this way, so hopefully this isn't a mischaracterization. But one of these things, like, in order for there to be a larger sense of a community relationship of Black studies, right, whether it's broad campus community or in the sort of broader world in which we all live, there also has to be that sense of community inside the department. When you were saying like that, every voice is heard, the differences aren't exclusionary, they are just plurality. That is such a challenge, but without that, it's really hard for Black studies departments to really do imaginative and expansive work. Also, University of Maryland, just where I teach, is rewriting their tenure and promotion expectations with shockingly, I mean, shockingly, because I just figure like there's going to be a consolidation of the worst of academia every time there's a rethinking, quote unquote, of something. But they're actually trying to have community-based research and expressive work. They're trying to figure out ways to talk about that in bureaucratic documents as full-weighted contributions towards tenure and promotion. And I remember I was associate chair last year, and so I was part of these conversations. And I was like, oh, this is danger zone. I was like, wait a minute. Actually, they're saying some really fantastic things that Black studies could teach them about, but also, would allow us to do Black studies work more deeply. Not to turn this into a John University of Maryland podcast, but just to say, I think so many people listening to this are going to have responses to all of these kinds of issues you raise, and building in so many of the imperatives of Black studies at the table when we're all there at a department meeting or having lunch together. How are we a community, and how do our voices work together? Because that's where we build from.
Yeah, and I think that there are so many scholars of different generations who bring new perspectives on how to do this work to the table. So I think about, there are, people like, Brittany Cooper and others who push beyond the boundaries of what intellectual work is supposed to, like bell hooks, for instance,
Yeah,
Audre
great
Lorde, right?
example.
Like thinking about, you know, what this work is for and what is rigor, right? Helping us
Mhm.
challenge, like, what is intellectual rigor? And how do we push also beyond the exclusionary practices of the academy,
Yeah,
right? And being able to write in multiple tongues, right?
that's
And then
hard.
choose one, right? I even, think about like Ngugi, like, one of my favorite texts, on the abolition of the English department. I mean, so many English departments are now, not just departments of English, but departments of literature and English. Like, what does it mean to really be about the work of decolonizing the academy? And
Mhm.
I see one important move is a generation of scholars who are like, I'm going to podcast. Like, I think of people like, is it Mark Lamont Hill or Mark Anthony Neal, who like the early podcasts, like when, we weren't really thinking about blogs in that way, right?
Mhm.
And really thinking about what it means to be a public intellectual,
Mhm.
right? And I think one of the things about with each generation is each generation they're brave. And they're just like, look, I'm going to do this work. I can write these books. Like, okay, I wrote these books. I wrote these 2 books, and I'm now going to do this other thing. And this also counts as intellectual work.
Yeah.
I'm reaching a different demographic. And, this takes my work beyond the confines of the classroom and really pushing and advocating for that. I mean, we have a generation of scholars right now who will leave a job in a minute. Like, they'll drive Uber. They're like, you know what? You're not going to mistreat me. And I think that each generation becomes more emboldened to create new avenues for doing the work. I mean, even like, of course, your partner is in, deeply engaged in digital humanities. Like, that was unheard of, right?
Yeah.
When I came out of graduate school. And so I think Black studies continues to lead in finding interesting and innovative and intellectually rigorous ways to tell these stories and to do this work.
Yeah. Yeah, that's thank you for that follow-up. I think it's important to recognize that the Black studies as a breaking ground
Mhm.
field rather than a field that's sort of, pushing a little bit or trying different things, but really having broken real ground and set real roots. You mentioned,
Mhm.
I don't know if you had in mind Left to Black, the Mark Anthony
Yes,
Neal series,
Mark Anthony Neal, exactly what
which
I was thinking about, Left of
yeah,
Black, yep.
he's
That began
also
as a blog, right? It began as
yeah,
a blog, and then, I mean, and I think people forget that he was really at the forefront of doing a lot of that work. You
yeah.
know?
Well, I mean, he's a friend of mine, and
Mhm.
so maybe it's that, but also this podcast. When Ashley Newby and I formulated this idea for this podcast, we were like, how can we be like the Spotify version of Left to Black? Like real intellectual conversations that
Yeah.
all kinds of people can listen to,
Mhm.
and everybody who listens is going to learn. Whether it's
Mhm.
just somebody, out for a walk and they work at whatever job, or a senior academic who's like hearing new or old perspectives, all of these things.
Mhm.
And
Mhm. Mhm.
Mark's project, he's also on the podcast early on.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, it's really exemplary. And I like you just naming that as Black studies boundary pushing.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Mhm.
it is hard to be that. Just in terms of mortality, to be in the generation where it's like younger scholars are challenging what I do. I was like, wait, that used to be me.
Yeah, and that's the thing, it's like we came in, we all came in as hot shit at the very beginning, you know what I'm saying? And and your career trajectory shifts and changes, and I think one of the things that Black Studies has to consistently do is be nimble, and we challenge each other from within. And that's one of the things I appreciate. I think even within our departments, I mean, it's not, we're not all holding hands and singing songs all the time, even, here at Oberlin. Like, we challenge each other and we challenge each other to grow. And sometimes that growth is really painful. And not just to grow as colleagues, but in terms of what we're delivering to our students. And also sometimes challenging our students, right? When they come forward and they want a particular kind of thing. And we say, okay, well, we can do that. But also, what are you doing? Like,
Mhm.
for instance, when the students say, well, I don't know what to do, I feel like really conflicted. And we're like, we bring you slave narrative. We bring you sorrow songs. We bring you, Mansa Musa. We
Mhm.
bring you the Mau Maus. I mean, Walter Rodney. We bring you all of this. We show you all these examples of the work that's to be done. And so you can find something, Let's talk about let's be proactive and talk about what you can do as opposed to feeling like you can't do. There are all these examples. And so I think that challenge from within, especially in terms of discussing gender and misogyny, sexism, violence, right, against women, queerphobia. I think there are Black studies scholars within the field who felt empowered to challenge other scholars in the field or just the field in general for not dealing with those issues. And I think that's really important to note. And I think that's where you've got sometimes the activism shows up within the field in terms of pushing to
Sure.
create new discourses and
Absolutely.
new language. And sometimes it shows up like, in terms of like the public intellectual work, like people who are on, I think about people like Eddie Glaude on MSNBC, people who have been able now to move into different types of spaces to bring that academic work forward. And so whereas some people talk about, well, the work just kind of stays in rooms and in articles, even if we think about how we publish in journals, the journals are not the same in terms like, you're hard pressed to find a paper journal. They're all digital now. Some of them are open access.
Hmm.
So I think that we continue, as I said, to lead and thinking about new ways to learn and share and do really wonderful work, reaching a wide variety of audiences, right? Even when it's messy, we're out here doing it,
I
to be
love that.
honest.
I love that. Thank you. No, wonderfully put again. Um, so I'm interested then to, as a follow-up, this
Mm-hmm.
transition to another question, is to ask you a little bit about, your approach, because you've talked about your interests in how they, how they shape, your approach to Black studies. And I'm interested to hear a little bit then also about how your background, your PhD was in
Mm-hmm.
comparative literature, which
Mm-hmm.
is, on the one hand, complit is a bit of a discipline, but it's really kind of a non-disciplinary
Mm-hmm.
field.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're in an Africana Studies department. And so you've spent all this time outside of traditional disciplines. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested to hear you reflect a little bit on how you think that has shaped how you conceive a research project and how you
Mm-hmm.
execute that project. But also, I always want to ask how you think it shapes how you approach and practice a classroom.
That's an excellent question. So my undergraduate degree is in English, and so in that experience, I felt a lot of confinement in
Hmm.
terms of what counted as like legitimate literary study. And so Comp Lit gave me the space to be diasporic, um, in ways that I didn't find possible in English programs, um, in the institutions that I applied to. And so, Comp Lit offered a diversity in terms of exposure and experience of language, um, and culture and tradition. I think because it
Mm-hmm.
was comparative, I mean, it's in the name, right? Because it was comparative by design, it offered me the flexibility, honestly, to do whatever I wanted. I wanted to be in graduate school to do what I wanted and not what I was told to do, is the best way I could think to describe it. I wanted to
Yes.
craft my own, I want to craft my own graduate journey, um, to tell a story. So, what story could I tell about Caribbean people and particularly Caribbean women writers who wrote about the experience of moving between boundaries, moving between spaces, and creating new communities, new Caribbean based communities in different contexts? Where was I going to be able to tell that story? And so Complet was the space that allowed me to do that. And I think that flexibility then, and I always say that I was spoiled because my mentors, there were no limitations. Like I published my first article when I was a master's student. Carol said, "This is a great paper. You should publish it." And I said, "What?" And okay. And I looked for a venue and I published it, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so that encouragement then emboldened me to continue to pursue a journey through my graduate program that allowed me to write this story in this text, this literary analysis, taking courses that helped me fill in the gaps in my knowledge. And so I think I came to Africana Studies already r- prepared to work in an interdisciplinary space where we asked a series of questions and recognized that sometimes one disciplinary space was not going to be able to answer all of the questions, and it was okay to reach into other disciplinary spaces to do that. Right? So where one road ended, you now had a crossroads, and you could move down the crossroads to, to help fill in those gaps, and then to come back and be able to bring all of that together. I think I like Imani Perry's work because kind of interdisciplinarity as a methodology really intrigues me. We are constantly talking about, particularly in my upper level courses, about racialized narratives, and the way that she talks about how racialized narratives are constructed. It requires that she move through different disciplinary spaces.
Yeah.
Like Farah Jasmine Griffin's "Read Until You Understand" is a perfect example of that for me. What I enjoy about that book is I think it's a masterclass in writing in general and thinking about how we tell these intellectual stories, right? That begin in a very small place or feel like a very small place of individual experience, but then that individual experience is exploded out to make connections and to be able to understand how that small experience is part of an aggregate, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think Comp Lit taught me that. And the training that I got by scholars who were diasporic scholars taught me that and got me ready to do the work in an Africana Studies department. And I think whereas I could easily be in an English department again, it would have to be the type of space that recognizes the importance of interdisciplinarity and doesn't, because sometimes, I've interviewed for, many positions since I've been at Oberlin. And one of the questions is whenever I interview in English departments, they say, well, what exactly is literary about your work? Your work is very Africana Studies. What's literary about it? I know when I'm asked that question, that's not the department for me.
Yeah. That's very nicely put. And I used a word that is very dear to me too when you were talking about your training in comparative literature, which is learning traditions, plural. And it's interesting to me because I think that word tradition is rightly often heard and viewed and discussed with a lot of skepticism because it's been a hegemonic,
Yeah.
it's been a tool of all kinds of crazy shit.
Mm-hmm.
But that idea of what it means to understand a tradition in order to understand one expressive site, right? A literary piece, a poem, a musical piece, whatever. That, as you said, I mean, I like, Imani Perry and Farah Jasmine Griffin and others as exemplary cases of this kind of study. But that's that part where if you're committed to that idea of understanding one thing requires all this other understanding, like you said, that's Africana Studies. And how do you get in that mindset? I like that comparative literature got you there because I do think coming from a traditional discipline into Black studies, I say as someone who has a philosophy PhD, it was totally overwhelming. I was like, what the hell? I just want to talk about this, blues piece. Why do I have to understand, Blassingame and Albert Murray and Zora Neale? And it was like, rest in peace, Jeff Ferguson, one of my dear friends and colleagues. And he was just like, well, welcome to Black Studies. You got to work twice as hard.
Listen, that part. And that is the thing is that what I realize is that folks, they talk about, being a dilettante, right?
Yeah.
Which is a messy coding for like you just, all over the place. You're not serious. You're not a serious scholar. I recognize how many don't understand the incredible amount of work that we do in Black studies to be able to make the types of connections that we make, right? Even, reading Shakespeare. I had someone who said to me, Shakespeare never left Stratford upon Avon. Like, what are you talking about? That, he, and I was like, what are you talking about? Right? That's so dumb. You think he just wrote Othello, just kind of popped out of his head, the Merchant of Venice, like that's all about anti-Semitism, and then when you do the work, right? But particularly the people who've done the pioneering work, like, Benedict Anderson, is it who wrote Othello's Countryman, which I might be mixing up his name, but actually I'm going to look it up. But these texts that help us, or these scholars that help us see that the connections were always there, but they were obscured or they were erased, right? Is really important. But you have to know how to you have to understand that you've got to do the work outside of your disciplinary space. Eldred Jones is his name. Eldred Jones wrote the book Othello's. Benedict Anderson talks about the elsewhere. That's something else. That's another conversation that we could have that's also really wonderful. How we have to we have no choice but to do the work. Like, other people can opine about how things don't exist or how these connections don't make sense, but we actually get dirty and go into the archive and go into the library and do that work to uncover where the connections are and why they matter, right? And I think that really is the work of Black Studies.
And that, I mean, for me, that's where we have a real weapon in those moments of degradation of Black Studies. To ask, like, what have you read? And it's like, well, I read Souls of Black Folk. It's like, have you also read all the other 50,000 pages of published Du Bois? Have you also read all these other people? Do you understand this moment of history? Have you read other literature on the sorrow songs and so forth? And
for real,
that moment, I believe in, sometimes you just got to kind of avalanche people when they're critics, because we have plenty of avalanche for those reasons you've articulated so well.
And tradition, like you mentioned tradition, I agree that tradition can be, because we always want to avoid being essentialists, right? So some of the early work was very essentialist. Like, even when we're talking about negritude, for instance. Yeah, we read Césaire, Senghor, Damas. A lot of that was really essentialist and talking about, the African spirit and all of that. And I think that was a point of departure. That was a place to start. And I think it was a valid place to start, right? And that is where they started. And that's fine.
Yeah.
And we can continue to grow. And yes, tradition, the idea of being stuck in tradition can be problematic. Like Toni K. Bambara talks about using the best of our traditions. Like, we can leave the rest behind, but we use the best of our traditions to move forward. She writes about that in The Salt Eaters, right? And I'm inspired by the work of scholar Vivek Clark, right, who talks about tradition in terms of, she talks about diaspora literacy, and it's the ability to be able to read simultaneous histories and experiences of Africanity existing on a continuum and simultaneously. And that work, she writes about that work requires a lot of labor and effort to be able to do it well. But when you are able to do it well, it opens up an entirely new universe. It's a whole galaxy of understanding and meaning that informs the way that you approach everything else, right? That text informs the way that the way that I approach Chaucer, right? Because another thing I can do, like in terms of my training, I can still recite the first 18 lines of the Canterbury Tales. And I can also tell you a lot about Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison and Omeros by Darrell Walker. I can do all of those things, right? Because my training is grounded in a particular type of diaspora literacy.
Great. I mean, could not agree more. I mean, we don't have we don't have video that goes along with these podcasts, but I have a very pleased face and body, because I just think this is so well put and so transformative in terms of the kind of work we do and the demands we put on ourselves, but also what I think is right to ask that other people recognize in the work that we do. Well, I think you've probably already spoken to these last two questions a bit, but I'll go ahead and ask them. The first of the last two is thinking about the history and future of the field of Black Studies. What do you think Black Studies has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Okay. It's a wonderful question. So I think I spent a lot of time talking about what Black Studies has done well. And I think one of the places that we continue to grow into is the ways that we talk about gender and gender identity and sexuality. I think we've done wonderful work in that area, particularly in terms of talking about gender, sexuality, and disability.
Mm-hmm.
I think about people like Moya Bailey, Turi Elise Pickens. I think there's a wonderful work. And I think that we have to continue to unearth the experiences of men and male identified people in enslavement in terms of gender-based exploitation and sexualized violence. I think that that's a place that many of us are reluctant to go. I think there's plenty of scholarship, and not that we can stop there, but there's quite a bit of scholarship that focuses on women's experiences. And I think that there's some work that's really amazing in that area. And I think that that is an archive that we continue to mine. I think the other thing is moving through the discussion of how we talk about Africa and Africanity in Black studies. I think there are still some tensions there that began in that 1970s period that we need to figure out how to continue to manage. So that's where that kind of tradition thing where, many scholars talk about, Africa as being frozen in time.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to continue to talk about Africa in Black studies as a dynamic space, constantly inventing and reinventing itself, and the dialogue between Africa and the diaspora that exists in a variety of ways, right? I always talk to students about how the artists and the musicians have been doing it. Like they've always been doing it, and the scholars catch up later.
So true.
Like if you think about the music, if you think about every era of music, and you think about, what some call jazz, right? And jazz fusion and bebop, like the kind of international community of musicians who engage, right, in making that music in ways that people don't know. And sometimes people hear that and it's like, oh, you're trying to take jazz away, from Black people who've been on U.S. soil for multiple generations. Not at all. Because often those connections are made on this same soil. And it's because of this long legacy of colonialism and imperialism. The United States is a colonial nation, right? And so I think kind of extricating the U.S. from that history, right, as we talk about all this 250, like our basic laws, many of them are based on British laws. Come on, still. So, yeah, we have the Constitution, but so how do we move not just as scholars into a better space in terms of doing that work? How do we translate that for our students? Because I think it's on our college campuses where we see these students as many of the Black populations of our campuses become more and more international.
Yeah.
And varied in terms of culture and cultural identity. There is a lot of mismanagement and miscommunication that happens in mass media in multiple spaces. It always saddens me when scholars replicate that work, right? When we do that work, that kind of hegemonic work, right? Instead of modeling and figuring out a way forward, not in a way that's super idealistic and utopian, but that we're willing to get dirty again and do that work. Let's put it all on the table. Like I'll tell students, okay, let's talk about all the stereotypes about X. Let's just put it all on the table. And these are in multiracial classes, and students are often frightened. They don't want to be outed as somebody who thinks, like, no, I'm not saying this is what you think. I'm asking you what the stereotypes are. Those are two different questions. And getting dirty and getting into all of that and talking about where it all comes from and piecing it together and separating it out. I think that we have the tools to do that work. And I think moving forward, like those are two spaces. There are so many others, but those are two spaces that I think we can really continue to make great strides, like in the next century of Black studies.
Thank you. Yeah. One of the things is and I, often will refer into a podcast, a very early episode with Keonga Taylor, she made this comment that really stuck with me, where I think it was in response to this very same question. And she said, she had the numbers. I can't repeat them. I don't remember them, but she was like, at the founding of Black studies, this percentage of Black Americans were African American, right? In 2025, when we recorded it, this percentage is a massive increase, are African, West Indian, Latin American immigrants, and their sort of firstborn U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, we have to rethink the Black and Black studies because of this. We can't just even demographically, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it just really stuck with me as such a challenge. And I like the way you put that really just in the classroom. Like, I've had moments where I haven't said sort of the exact vocabulary, but those kinds of exercises about putting things on the table. And boy, they get a little vertigo with that. But I'm like, this is a part.
It gets messy for them. And I think that, and that is for me the challenge. So yes, like when we look at the numbers and the demographics, and I think, what Dr. Taylor was talking about is that Black people who have been on U.S. soil for 250 plus years are underrepresented in that context, right? That's the narrative. And I understand it. And at the same time, how do we talk about that without being angry or challenging the fact that the Black people who are maybe first, second, third generation are also there? The point is that the numbers should grow. So there shouldn't be diminished numbers of Black, because the narrative is that the people for whom the work was created for are not in those spaces, right? And also, there are Black people all over the world who come to the U.S. for a variety of reasons. So if we need to reframe what Black, does Black only mean Black in the United States for 250 years? There are Black liberation movements and Black liberation struggles all over the world. There was a Black arts movement in the United States. There was a Black arts movement in Europe, in London. We've got negritude. We've got, thinking about movements in Brazil, Central, South America. So how do we have that conversation without feeling, how do we verbalize that threat? So what does that mean about admissions policies, right? What does it mean about economic demographics, right? Let's figure out what is preventing a demographic of Black students who were highly visible, right? What's preventing them from getting access to those spaces? Mm-hmm. For me, those are the bigger and broader questions, because Black in 2026 doesn't necessarily mean something different than it meant in 1976, because you've got people of African descent all over the world identifying themselves as Black. I think once we get into this particular messy ass melting pot is when it gets challenging, because Black people from other parts of the world reject a particular type of kind of hegemonic idea of American identity, right? That sometimes they mishear as Black as in Black American, right? And then that gets read as not wanting to be Black and American. But sometimes it can be about some messy colonial stuff, but sometimes it can be about not wanting to have their own cultural identity that they brought with them erased. So I think and so these are the types of conversations we have. What does it mean if we move back a little bit from our own kind of visceral responses to all of this and think about where it all comes from? How about we talk to, first and second generation African and Caribbean and Latin American and so on folks about the ways in which racism functions at the level of mass media, so that they maybe come to the United States with these very messy ideas about African Americans in this space. But then also we could talk about African Americans and, how those same kind of messages about hungry and poor Haitians or Africans and flies, like how do we talk about it? Like, let's unpack it, right? Rather than kind of get caught up in, I think, the kind of really problematic institutional practices that are designed to prevent us from having those conversations in really rigorous ways, right? I'm not sure if I'm explaining that as well as I should be.
No, absolutely.
But I always feel like in Black studies, like this is the place where we get to do better.
Yeah.
Like, how do we do that work, right? Like and this is no disrespect to Dr. Taylor. Like I could feel a kind of way about the, diminished numbers of a particular demographic of Black people in the space, right? I can, and it makes sense to, right? And then what do I do with that? What is the work that I do with the students who actually are in that space? What conversations do I have with admissions? And I've done that as chair of Africana Studies. I'm like, look, I'm seeing that you all are going to particular types of places, these particular boarding schools, da-da-da-da. Like, what's up with some of these other schools? Even if you say you don't get that many students, even if you get one or two, those students, that kind of has legs, right? So how do we think about these different kind of practices and better educate our staff to think about that too?
Yeah. And Kianga, just putting it at the very title of this conversation, this podcast, the field, right? The Black and Black Studies is, I think, the beginning and maybe the, the persistent one and only question of Black Studies. What do we mean by that? And I love the way you put that. It was perfectly clear, by the way. But it really, so much of what you're asking of Black Studies as a field and the people in it requires what you had previously articulated in terms of being expansive and serious as people about that commitment to community, because that requires the best of communities, which is, as you said, where you have multiple kinds of voices, a plurality of voices, and they are all heard. And what does it mean to be heard? And what does it mean to be voices in that space? And it can be messy, but to be heard and messy is different than to be messy and to be hegemonic.
Yeah, so we have to challenge each other, and that's fine. And sometimes it turns out well, and sometimes it doesn't. But to have the conversations, I think, really, really matters. And then to figure out how we want to move forward. Like, what did we learn? What did we gain? How can we use this, right? And how does this inform the way we do our scholarship and our teaching and our activism?
Yeah. And the truth is, traditions, to go back to that word, traditions never move without agitation and agonism.
Yeah.
So,
and we have to be able to understand them. Like, we have a whole, African and African diasporic dance curriculum in Africana Studies, right? Those colleagues are jointly appointed with dance. And I mean, those students, they can't understand how to grow and change and build if they don't understand the tradition. So I think there are some contexts in which, we have a whole jazz studies program in the conservatory founded by the late Dr. Wendell Logan. And his goal was to make sure that students understood the tradition out of which jazz emerged. Because you can get up and you can play. But if you don't understand the traditions, then, the even the performance is hollow.
Yeah.
But how you approach the work is hollow. And so I think there's a way for us to engage tradition as a space of dynamism without getting stuck and mired in the stuff that we can leave behind.
Well, maybe you've already spoken then a bit to this last question, but I'll go ahead and ask it as a way of wrapping up. Thinking in a Black Studies context, what is the question you would want us to be asking or the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
There are so many. I made a list actually in preparation for this question, and now I don't like my list as much.
It's funny because a lot of people will say, can I come back in a couple weeks
Right.
for this question?
Sometimes with my students, I ask them to probe the so what, right? And yeah, that's your thesis, and so what? So why does it matter? So the question wouldn't be why Black Studies matters. It would be to constantly think about who are we doing this work for? What is the function of this work, right? That question grounds me because it forces me to focus on what the purpose of the work is. For me as a scholar, the writing is not the beginning and the end. And for some people it is, like, to get the ideas out. For me is, how is this useful? What can we do with it? Why does it matter? Not why does it matter? I take that back. How is this useful? What can we do with it? What is it a tool for? Is it for liberation? Is it for empowerment? Is it for better understanding? Is it to change and affect policy? Is it like, how can we use this? For me, it's like always, how can we use this? And then what is the question, right? And then what? And now what? Now that we have it, now what are we going to do with this? What are we going to do? Maybe that's the best question. Okay, and now what are we going to do for Black Studies?
That's such a perfect place to wrap up, Meredith.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for that. And thank you for your thoughtfulness and time. I was really looking forward to this. This has just been such an interesting and engaging conversation. It's really, really a fantastic contribution to the series. Everybody listening to it will have so much to think and talk about. So I thank you for that. I thank you for your time and thoughtfulness, but really for such a wonderful contribution to our series. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And also thank you for this invitation and this opportunity to talk about the work. Oddly enough, there aren't enough opportunities for us to do this.
Yes, this is so funny because this has come up in many podcasts, sometimes on but often after or before conversation. People just say, we never really stop and talk about why we do what we do and what our foundational values are. So I love that. It makes me think really hard about mine all the time, and this episode definitely will.
Thank you so much for the invitation. This is a wonderful opportunity for us as scholars and thinkers and creatives and artists and, to think about all the ways that Black Studies functions, right? And the doors that it opens and continues to open for so many of us, and especially for our students as well. There's nothing more gratifying than my students being out in the world and doing wonderful things and then circling back and saying, it's in your class or in that time or in that conversation. I guess that for me is paying it forward, because that's really what sparked my passion for this work in the first place. It was that engagement in the classroom. So thank you for this and all that you do and for the work that you're doing at University of Maryland and beyond. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And, same thanks to you for all of those things. So you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. And you too. Enjoy the sunshine.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.